Okay, welcome. I am Kathy Hampton from Wellside Retreats. Wellside Retreats is a transformational destination retreat and life coaching service for primarily Black women, is where my audience is. And I help women move away from what no longer serves them and help them move toward what will serve them well. Thank you for joining us for this live uh, video today. Today, I have a person I've known for a while who's going to share her practice of wellness. And now, wellness, the definition of or the concept of wellness is an individual pursuit, and a pursuit being in action, and the state of being in good health. So, Saundra Gilliard
Mhm.
is a practitioner of wellness, but she does quite a bit. But one of her passions is helping women rewrite their stories. So I wanted to bring her on and allow you all to get to know what she has to offer, and to see if she could maybe assist you in your pursuit of wellness. So, Sandra, can you introduce yourself? I'm glad to have you on today. This is probably my second live video that I've done, and I'm glad to have you on here with me.
That's how- So thank you, Kathy. I'm Saundra Gilliard, and I'm so happy to be here. So honored that I get a chance to share the space with you, particularly with wellness and Black women. Story told that we are the least attended to when it comes to our health because we're so conditioned to take care of everyone else. So I applaud you for taking that on and also for having me to share my brand of wellness and self care. I am a storyteller. I have been a storyteller professionally for 25 years, but a storyteller all my life. I grew up with story. I think I remember about the third grade that my mother could not read. And her whole life, she taught me through story. And I just thought she was just such a wise woman. But when I found out that she couldn't read, I understood the power of story, so that she was able to explain to me the do's and don'ts, and as they would say, the wise tales. She taught me history and everything through what she had heard, not what she read, but what she had heard. And she was able to pass those things on to me. So I became very vocal and very alive in terms of my ability to share what was around me. And so I was labeled, the little storyteller. And when I went to school, I didn't. It wasn't until I was in school that I began to hear about the fairy tales because my mother didn't read. I didn't hear about a lot of fairy tales, and we weren't in a position where I would get to go see Disney movies and those types of things. So I started looking at story in terms of a written structure when I was in school. And at that time, I was only learning about the fairy tales and folk tales that were allowed. And, I'm 65, so you can imagine what was, the stories that were told during that time. But when my children started going to school and the same stories were being read to them, I said, this has got to stop. So I began to go into schools and tell them the stories that my mother and my father had told me about our history, about, where they lived. I knew the South better than most Southerners through the stories that my mother had told me. And so I went and started telling stories, just basic history stories. And then I started reading African folk tales and folklore, and I started reading fairy tales too, and I began to tell those. And I found that the thing about story was that it was a tremendous teaching tool. And I started using storytelling as to augment teaching. And I became a professional storyteller during that time, using storytelling in schools. Then at the time I was working for a consulting firm doing change management, and I found that when I was actually training in that capacity, I would incorporate stories. And I saw
Mm.
the tremendous impact that stories had on helping people understand a difficult situation or even to buy into what it was that we were trying to change. And that's when it hit me that stories, more than my mother using it as a mode for me to understand, I understood story power in terms of shifting perspective and understanding. And I got involved with a wonderful organization, the National Association of Black Storytellers, and I realized how powerful stories was, around the world. So in 1996, my eyes opened up into the power of story. Fast forward that to working in corporate, I was getting to a point where I was beginning to feel the burn of being a female in a male-dominated society, and I couldn't understand, like, why did I have to change myself so much to fit in? And then it dawned on me, I was living the story that was given about what it meant to be successful in a male-dominated environment. And
Right.
I remember this clearly. One day I was standing in front of the mirror, dressed in my corporate attire, the double-breasted jacket, the pencil skirt, the 2-inch pumps. I had the whole uniforms, and I always wore a string of pet pearls just to give it like a little feminine touch. But I knew the rules, not to be opinionated, not
Right.
to become emotional, not
Mhm.
to be
Mhm.
compassionate. But all of that wasn't me. And I
Right.
realized that I had brought into that story. And I
Mhm.
started
Mhm.
studying women's history, and I started studying what it meant to be a woman, to be in a patriarchal society, because before I never questioned it because that's the way we grew up. But the minute I started questioning it, Kathy, I realized that it was all a story. It
Mm.
was stories that we were told about the weakness of women. It was stories that we were told about the strength of men. It was stories that we were told about what our place was. And we brought into those stories and lived our lives based on those stories. And so that's when I decided to take my love for storytelling and my knowledge for the passion and power of story and to use it as an advocacy for women.
Okay, that's great. That is wonderful. I had no idea that there was such an organization as the Black Storytellers
Yes,
Association. That's
yes,
phenomenal.
yes.
Um, well, okay. So as far as that's a great introduction. I mean, how your personal comes and meets up with the professional, but then goes back to somewhat personal when it comes to um, I self awareness, which I advocate for women being aware of what they feel, what they see, what they hear, um, and how it affects them. So all of that comes back to your personal development.
Mhm.
So tell us this. Tell us what is rewriting one story.
So let me give you an example of rewriting on stories. You know that everything that we know, feel, and hear and lodge in our body comes from externally. So if you grew up in a home where you've experienced trauma, that trauma lodges in your body, and sometimes it show up as cancer, other
Mhm.
illnesses, depression. And when we go back to, we go to medicine and they treat that particular incident, but they don't treat the root of it. And the root of our illnesses sometimes can be lodged in what we believe about ourselves and about what's around us. And so when I grew up, my mother, the story about her was that she was a drunk. And so when I
Mhm.
grew up, with having this mother who was a drunk and who, for what society told me, could not care for me. That there were so many negative uh, titles that she was given. And I believed it. I believed that I grew up with this mother who was a drunk, and she wasn't like the June Cleaver. She didn't bake the bread. And, so I grew up thinking that I came from a broken home. That was the story that society told me, that I had a mother who was incapable of taking care of me. And then all these traumas about being the child of a person who abused alcohol. When I grew up and I began to work with women and telling stories and having them rewrite stories, I understood that there are certain things that are considered mental illnesses. And the purpose or the reason that people began to pull onto alcohol is
Right.
the thing that we have to fix. And when I went back and researched my mother's story, I realized that my mother grew up in a very traumatic environment. At 18 years old, she moved from a small little island on a southern sea coast. She was from the Gullah Islands to New York at 18, pregnant with me. No, no support, no nothing to. And so I'm thinking that's enough to drive anybody to drink it. She couldn't read, and so I looked at that as her self medication. That there was nothing wrong with her per se, that she had found a way to self-medicate. And there was no help from her. As I began to go back and look at my story, she didn't have access to a 12-step program. She didn't have access.
Right.
She didn't have access because we lived in an urban environment, where those things were supposed to happen to us. And she was a
Mm.
part of that. And when I thought about, when they told me that she was an unfit mother, I thought my mother would die and go to hell for me. At no point was I abused. I never went to bed hungry. My mother made sure that if she didn't sleep, that I had a place to stay. So her ability to be a mother was not impacted by her ability, her drinking. I'm not saying that happens with everyone, but that's my story. And when I began to look at my story about my mother, and how I had held so much in my stomach, so much venom for her because I labeled her as a drunk and an unfit mother. But when I went back to what it meant to rewrite my story about her, I also rewrote hers. And by doing that, I understood,
Okay.
her. I understood her trauma, which meant that
Right.
I found love for her then, and I
Right.
and I and I understood how hard it was as a woman
Right.
to go through. We're talking about the
Mm-hmm.
50s. And
Mm-hmm.
I was able to change my story, which kind
Mm-hmm.
of released the knot I had in my stomach about her. And I
Right.
was able to lay her to bed,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that I understood where you
Mm-hmm.
were based on your story that you didn't
Right.
have a chance to rewrite. And that gave me more energy to say that, women, we hold so much in terms of our legacy, in terms of the way we've been defined. We internalize that, and that becomes that shows up as it's ailments in our bodies.
Sure. So that's yes, yes. And so, I am a proponent of journaling and
Mhm,
writing, writing to be read, not necessarily to be published. Although many of us want to be published. I believe that the tool of writing helps those things come up in our in our pages,
mhm,
and so when you started talking about your mother's story, I'm in the process of writing a memoir and
mhm.
have been doing so for a long time. But what I found out is that me writing about these people has also had me questioning the who these people are in that I'm writing about. And so I've done the work to find out kind of the backstory
Yes.
for myself,
Mhm.
so that I am aware of who these people are. So that's a great example of how one rewrites
I
their
want to
story.
make a comment here about
Hmm.
journaling and the actual get to the point of actually telling the story,
Sure.
so that you can hear it and that you can
Hmm.
feel it. And so when I think about memories, are usually our impetus to start our restructuring of our story. And you may have a memory, like you said, you're writing your memoir, and you look
Hmm.
at what has transpired through your life,
Right.
and you get that down, and then I go back and storyfy all of those things.
Okay.
So
That's what.
I might take a particular memory. Like my mother, I ended up writing a play about that because I
Okay.
storyfied it so much. And what I mean by this term storyfy is a term that I came up with, is that how do you take your memories and then make them stories? Because memories don't give you all of the facts you need to create a
That's
story.
right.
It
That's
just
right.
gives you your remembrance of it, which may not be the reality of what happened. Because,
That's right.
memories are subjective. If you were hurt, all you remember is being hurt,
Yes.
but you may not remember the other stuff around it. Storyfying it helps you to understand what is around all of it. So you begin to understand the whole perspective of it. And so, for instance, I'll go back to my mother's story. For me, labeling her as a drunk, having this growing up, poor me, I had a mother who was drunk because I didn't understand her story. When I went back, I remembered being hurt because my mother was a drunk. But when I began to look at the characters around my stories, I began to look at their motives. I began to look at their beginning, their middle, and their end. Then I understood my mother, the character in my story.
Got it.
Okay.
Got
And
it.
then when I understood her, I was, like most characters, you either feel sorry for them or you understand them that made me look at my story differently. So I didn't have
Right.
this mother who was just such a terrible mother that I grew up thinking.
Right.
It helped me
Right.
understand because I was able to go back and put my memories into a story form. You start to look at the places you're in, the characters who's a part of your story, what's their motives.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you begin to look at things that way.
Okay. Thank you. I like that. Storify it. That's good. Um, so um, I think you answered this question. How did you begin the practice of rewriting stories? You did that really in
I
your.
did that for my own healing. As I said, my daughters, I have two daughters, and they begin. I held the venom from my mother, in terms of what I thought she should have been for me, so much that I didn't even mention her name, really, unless it was in some kind of negative standpoint. I adored my father, but I would never mention my mother in any lovable light because she was a drunk and everything I knew about being a drunk and being neglected and, the whole bit. But when my daughter started asking me, well, everybody else has a grandmother. Like, I know she's not here, but and I wanted to be able to explain to them, and I thought to them, but it came out to be myself about my mother. And that's what prompted me to go back and rewrite that story. That was 30 years after my mother's death. So I did not, and so now my mother and I are as close as we could have ever been because now I know her story, at least from my perspective. I knew the story that she wasn't able to tell me. And as Black women, we hold so many stories and secrets. Things that have come in from a legacy that we hold.
Yes.
We hold them because either it's embarrassment,
Yes.
or we don't know a lot of things. It's trauma. We hold so many stories, and I didn't want my daughters to still hold on to that legacy that I had. So my first story was to break that chain between my mother and I. And then secondly, it became to me to be able to live life on my own terms. I began to rewrite the story that I understood myself as what it means to be a woman. And
Right.
that's the piece I now take out to the world. Like let's re-examine what we've been told about what it means to be a woman.
Great. That's great. Okay. Yes. And in a minute, I'm gonna talk a little bit. I'll have you just mention some of the things that you've done in community with your writing and your storytelling. So Sassy Diva JJ, who is we affectionately know as Janet, says, "I'm glad you dug deep, Saundra." That's one of the comments we have
Thank you.
online right now. Janet as well as Francine, and these are some of my mastermind sisters who are very supportive and wanted to. We're excited about hearing
Thank you.
about you. Um, so the next question is the practice. Is this practice for transformational? Have you experienced any of your clients go through, you know, a transformation, a change
Mhm.
when rewriting their
Mhm.
stories? How do women? How does it affect a woman?
Okay. So when you learn something differently, there is a change. But the key point here is, as you said, transformation. And transformation means that you've taken what you've learned anew and you've actually put it into action. We know a lot of things. We can learn a lot of things, but if we don't put them into action, there's really no transformation. We just have expanded our knowledge on a particular subject. So when we talk about the process for going through a transformation from a story-based rewrite, is that you begin to, first of all, ask questions. That's how you have to start, is to ask questions. What is it that you're questioning? If there's something that comes up to you that you want to have an answer for, you go back and you go where all stories start, in the beginning. And for us, in the beginning means our past. We are the combination of everything we have lived, every experience we have. Everyone is a story in progress. And so you want to go back to look at, where did that question that you have, where did it originate? It could have been in your family matrix, your family structure. It could have been, the environment you were given. Remember, we get stories from everywhere. We get stories from society. We get stories from home. We get stories from everywhere. And you have to go back and find out what is in your subconscious mind that has you, number one, behaving the way you are, thinking the way you are, or have the perspective that you have. So that's the beginning, and for my terms, that is your past. So we spend time just going over the past, and that's painful. That's painful, but there's things that we have lodged in our subconscious mind that the subconscious doesn't know whether it's real or unreal. And so we have to decide whether those things that we have based our life on, are they real or unreal? How do they make us feel? And that's part of the healing. So when you have a trauma, we begin to unpack that. And as you know from doing your work, that trauma comes up. It uncovers some things, but you have to be able to look at that. And then then we go to the beginning. Every story has a story structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is the way we look at things. So our past is really the most important, because we want to know where our stories began. And then we look at where we are in the present, like, how do we live in that story? What is it doing? And that's where the real work begins. How we live in the story.
How you function.
It's showing up in the way we spend our money, and the way we dress, and the way we feel, and the way we relate to each other. It shows up. I mean, we wear our story. It shows up.
Okay, that is good. Yeah, my saying is, we dress up our pain.
I love it.
We dress up that pain, and we look so fly and hip. But if we were to just take pieces of those garments, you would see the pain. No one knows that a finely dressed woman is going through so much stuff, because she looks so good. And Black women look good all the time. We look so good.
And that was one of the ways we had to hide our pain. We find a way, and so we wrap our stories up in these coverings, and which is why this is a term, which is why Black women suffer in the dark for so long, because we don't express our story. Right. And a lot of us, think that the woes of the Black woman, that this story is just such a story of despair. But the truth is, if you go back and look at the history of Black women, that is not our story.
That's right.
If you look at the strength, those are stories that I try to get us to remember. That's not our story. We look at women of strength, women who have made a way out of no way. Women who have been able to stand up when everyone else falls around them. It's just that women that have carried the even the civil rights. Our story isn't told about our participation in leadership and how we have managed to keep our communities together. So we carry the wrong story.
Yes.
So that's what we hear. And so mine is a mixture of the stories that you were told, and then the stories that were kept away from you. And those are the stories that I tell my daughters. So like with my daughters, I made sure they knew, when they talk about science, they know Oh, no, 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 no. You not because you're Black. That means because here are women who didn't have as much as you've had. That's your Cinderella story. You know, you know,
You're right. You're right.
and even
That's right.
you recently, I'm doing a program tomorrow about story and how women are supposed to relate to money. And
Hmm.
I tell my daughters that no, we had millionaires. Everybody knows Madam C.J. Walker, but we had women who were able to sell chicken dinners to buy houses.
That's
When
right.
money wasn't done. So
That's right.
don't say that we don't know how to manage our money. It's just that we
Right.
brought into a new story.
Story.
So
Yes.
let's change the
Yes.
stories.
Yeah. Oh,
And
this
so
is
that's what it is.
great. It's great, Sandra. I'm going to be doing later in April a segment on wellness and money,
Mm-hmm.
and how we don't talk about that
Oh yeah.
either. Yeah, that's a big secret. There's so much shame in it. So
Mm-hmm.
Francine says, this has inspired me to go home to write the stories of the women
Mm.
in my life from my POV, my
Point of view.
mother, my point of view,
Mm-hmm.
my mother, my sister, my daughters, myself. I see this as a major path to healing. Thank you.
And I would say to you, I would say I applaud you for doing that because we have our stories. Remember, our stories as Black women in this country have not really come from us. We've been silenced. So we haven't been able to tell our stories. And even when we're in the church kitchens and we can't tell our full stories because number one, it's couched in the biblical stories. You know,
Right.
so we don't get a chance to talk. And and as the saying go, when you know better, you do better. So I make sure that for my daughters, when I read an article or hear something about a Black woman who's doing something, I storyfy it. If that becomes her story, that's the
Yeah.
story I tell them at night to go to bed. That's the story that we will take our daughters to see the Disney movies. But let me ask you this: what kind of money management does those princesses do? What do they do? They get a man to take care of them. And so we have our daughters running around about, they want to be princesses. I'm like, what are we
Yeah.
teaching them?
Yeah.
And that's not the
Awesome.
reality. It's not the reality. But
Right. Right.
we have to learn how to scrutinize stories that we hear. And they're not made for us. And
Mhm.
even if they Blackenize the characters, they still not made for us. So
Right.
let's look at these stories, and we have
Mhm.
to take control of the narrative that defines us.
Mhm.
And that
Mhm.
means
Mhm.
that we're going to have to let go of some of the things that no longer serve us.
Right.
Some
That's
of these
right.
attitudes and beliefs, and I know that's
That's
one of
right.
your pillars, is that some of these
Mhm.
attitudes and beliefs, they might be cute, but they don't
Mhm.
serve us.
They don't serve us. That's
And so,
right.
and because they don't serve us, that means that something inside of us is not being met,
Right.
which means it comes out in depression. It comes out in fibroids. It comes out in headaches. It comes out in hypertension. It comes out in
Mhm.
all these things that ail Black women. And we can heal ourselves and change our stories.
Yes. Yes. All right, Sandra. Keep it going. Francine, you start writing.
She better write.
Start writing.
She better write and publish so that other women can
Yes.
know her story and her strength. When I talk about my
Yes.
mother, I tell you how many women go back and re-examine their relationships with their mother.
Mhm.
You know, it's just that
I
let's go
know.
back and re-examine it.
Yep, I know it. I know. I probably 8 years ago,
Mhm.
I while doing this memoir, which was on one subject that turned and shifted as I went along to a different subject,
Mhm.
and that just so happens to be my mother. I started
Mm.
examining and asking questions, and then finally asking her questions.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm blessed to still have her,
Mhm.
but a lot of things have come up recently that I'm still asking these questions, and I still have her. Luckily, in my life, I'm
Mhm.
blessed to have her. No matter which way
Yes.
we get along,
Mm-hmm.
and we do get along, but the questions have to be asked because she is still here for a
Mm-hmm.
reason,
Mm-hmm.
and she's well enough to ask the questions because she actually is a great storyteller.
Wow.
She can sit you down, and they become hilarious, but they're
Mm-hmm.
actually in the back when you listen to, there are some sad stories.
Yes.
There's sad stories. Um, and we've heard them over and over again. She's the type of person who tells the story over and over again
Mm-hmm.
because of her love for her family members, her
Mm-hmm.
love for her brothers, her mother, and her father. Um, and there was some contention in the family, which brings up the drama, which
Mm-hmm.
then brings up these huge stories, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's the comedy. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it could be even black comedy
Mm-hmm.
within her stories. So yeah,
Well,
but she's also very good at hiding her
yeah.
story.
Yeah. So you
So,
have to find out. You brought
yeah,
up something that I was thinking about when you said that, the repetitiveness of the stories that she tells, that signifies to me that that's something important in her life. That she
yes,
repeats it, that, it needs to
yes,
be said to her. And then
yeah.
maybe there needs to be an understanding that you may have to get as to why it's important in her life. The
Yes.
other thing is
Okay, that's
that
interesting. Okay.
when we look at our stories, and they're not just for the telling and understanding, but remember, we're doing this as a healing process. And so we're
Mhm.
dealing so if you're telling us, if you're going back and looking at a story, and the one thing you want to know is like, how do you feel about that particular information you picked up? And because
Mhm.
our feelings then, creates our values and our
Right.
behaviors. And
Right.
so if you feel hurt, you want to
Mhm.
understand
Mhm.
why, because that
Mhm.
hurt is showing up somewhere in your
Right.
perspective, in your, like, for instance, the way that a lot of Black women will say they have towards the men in their lives. If you
Mhm.
dig deep enough, you usually find out there was some story that has been lodged, either was passed on to them by the women that they grew up with, or an experience that they've had, in the past, that have formulated their idea and perspective about relationships, and they bring that into the past, and that's the way they live. You have women
Mhm.
who overgive, who try to please, and even though they might not have learned pleasing from a man, their mother may have always tried to please. And so therefore they
Right.
enter into relationships over pleasing, So we want to
Yes.
go back, and now we want to go back and look at these stories to see how they have constructed our matrix, because that's the healing part of it, learning how we are functioning as a result of the experiences that we've had in our lives, which are our stories. I was working with someone, and we found out that she had this need to belong, just to belong.
Mm.
And it went way back in school, where she wasn't allowed to do certain things because her mother was protecting her, and so she didn't get
Okay.
a chance to those class trips when she was in, lower school, and she didn't do this, and she never felt like she really belonged. And she grew up, she's a lawyer. She grew up, most of us would think as a perfect child, but she never felt that she really belonged to anything. And she always
Mhm.
felt like inside, she always felt like an outsider, because she
I
never
see.
felt that she could ever make that attachment to truly belong. And we
Mm.
discovered that that came back from when she wasn't allowed to do things and go places and be with people because of
Right.
protection. Her mother
Protection.
protected her. And when we
Right.
talk about, that's now you're old enough to protect yourself, you're old enough to make decisions that now you don't have to, that doesn't serve you anymore. You
Yeah.
can let that go.
That's
And
right.
you can go and travel by yourself and do these things and create
Yeah.
this new life that you want. So
Yeah.
yeah, so when we go back and look at them, we need to understand what patterns and feelings and behaviors and thoughts and values
Mhm.
that we take
Yes.
away from that. And then when we start to massage that, that is where the healing comes in.
Okay. So healing is the goal. Healing is the
Healing is the
ultimate
goal.
goal. And healing takes time.
It takes time.
And
It takes courage. It takes
it
time.
takes time.
And you mentioned it right. You mentioned the word earlier. It takes transformation. So
Yes.
we can know all of this, and we're not going to do anything with it, and we're not going to do anything differently. We've just gained a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
the goal is to live a new story.
Yes.
And
Yes. To
sometimes
live a new story.
to
That's
live a
good.
new story, you
Yeah.
rewrite it so you can. So that's why when I say that I help women rewrite the story so they can live the life that they want to live. Most of us are not happy in our life. We're not happy for one reason or another. We have so many phases of life. We have a financial phase, we have a relationship phase, we have a spiritual phase, we have a body image phase. We have so many phases in our life. And we're usually not happy in one or all of those phases.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And so it's a lifelong process, but at least we know to start. At least we know that there's a start and there's a process that we can begin
Yes.
to look at.
Yes. So, Sandra, I want to ask the people who have logged in and watching if they have any questions while we have you. We'll take a couple questions, but I do want to ask you, who is your favorite storyteller?
Zora Neale Hurston.
Ah,
And I say that because Zora was bold enough to go back, and she said, no, you're not scrubbing their voices. No, she allowed women to speak in their voice and their dialect. And when I go back and research the stories that she uncovered, that's when I got to know Black women. I got to know Black women because she let them speak the way they spoke. She told their stories, unapologetically. And that's hard. Most people don't do that because they want to make sure it's showing up correctly in writing, and she just went back and told the stories. And I love and appreciate her for that. And because she did that, she did not get the notoriety that she deserved until her death.
that's right.
Because she went against the grain, but she did it. And so she gave me that voice. And when I start questioning, when I have people question fairy tales and folk tales, and people go, "Oh, they're sacred." But I recognize that when I started recrafting stories, even to perform for children, I had to make the stories relevant to them. So I could take an old folk tale, but then most of them would never see in sort of schools I were in. They never saw tortoises and foxes, and I mean that So I would have to change the story, kept the moral the same. You keep the motif, but you make the story relevant so that they could understand the lesson in the story. And the same thing is that my model came from the way that Jesus Christ taught through parable stories. And when his disciples asked him, "Why are you going around telling these people stories?" And he said, "I tell them so they could understand."
Okay.
And so when I look at Zora Neale Hurston, that was her main purpose, that she wanted us to understand us.
Right.
So
Right.
and I appreciate that about her.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I love about Zora Neale Hurston, she was an anthropologist, first of all and foremost, but she questioned out loud
Yes.
her her questions about Black people, Black women. There's I was reading, I forget what book it is, but she was in New York on the subway or on the train, and she says, I wonder why Black women or Black girls talk so loud, why they express themselves so loud. And there was this whole discussion of how we express ourselves. And and that is what I started learning to do, is think about observing people and asking the questions. Like, one of my things about public transportation, this is maybe totally off base, but I'm going to say it. I watch people on public transportation and how uncomfortable we are in the seats. And
Mhm.
certain cities and certain towns have different configurations for the seats.
Mhm.
And sometimes black people don't fit in those seats because they
Yes.
might be too big.
Mhm.
And who are they trying to serve? Where is
Mhm.
their budget going? They don't take
So
into consideration the whole idea that we are all different sizes and they don't ask those questions or take
mhm.
surveys. So I
Mhm.
started doing my own thing. Why did they do that? Or
Well,
why are we
we
doing
live in a patriarchal society, and
right?
that patriarchy
Right.
is white males. And
Right.
so everything,
Right.
our educational system, our financial system, every system that we have is based on that perspective.
Mhm.
That is why we
Mhm.
got to rewrite these narratives, get our
That's
voice
right.
heard,
That's
so
right.
that, and I thought that, most people think that being a feminist is a hate male thing. No, being a feminist is just not wanting to live under patriarchal systems like this,
Right.
so that
Sure.
everyone is taken into consideration.
Consideration.
Mhm.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So you have Saundra tomorrow. You're doing a class, or what are you doing
I'm doing a
tomorrow?
free webinar. I'm
Okay.
with a friend of mine, and we're talking about the one sphere of our lives is the financial sphere. And I am
Mhm.
doing a workshop on just walking through changing stories. How do you change
Okay.
stories? And then a friend that I'm actually working with is an attorney who does a generational wealth, and she's going to talk about women's attitudes and behaviors in terms of creating generational wealth. That is
Okay.
something that we haven't. We lived for today. Most of us,
Hmm.
our parents
Right.
told us to live for the day, take care of yourself
Yeah.
today,
Yeah.
and then maybe have enough. Listen, my mother, maybe have enough to bury me, but other than that,
Yeah. Right.
but women,
Uh,
the black women control so much money. We have so much
yeah.
money. You look at the hair, the nails, and the makeup.
The
We
clothes.
control so much money that we need to
Yeah.
start looking at generational wealth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Kay Williams will be doing the piece on generational wealth, and I will be do the piece on uncovering your attitudes and beliefs about what it
Okay.
means to be rich and wealthy, because we know we have some
Okay.
hangups around those too.
Yes.
Well, from the stories that we've been told,
Cool.
it's not inherent. It's not that we can't change them. It's just that we haven't heard any other stories,
Exactly.
that's directing that.
Exactly. So you gave me your website. I'm going to put that up,
Mhm, mhm.
www.femininelyfree.com. And is there anything else you want to leave us with or tell
Uh,
us about or
well,
what
I want
you?
to leave you with two things. Number one is that what I'm doing tomorrow is a Bitly link, and
Oh,
uh,
hold on.
is
Let's see if I can write it in here. What's the? Can you tell
okay. It's
me what that is? Uh huh.
www.bit.ly
Okay. Ly. Uh
and
huh.
then forward slash,
Okay.
and then it's right lowercase WRITE,
Uh huh.
and then uppercase HER,
HER.
and then lowercase story STORY.
You said uppercase HER
Yeah, all three
and
uppercase,
then the
and then
story.
lowercase story. So it's
Okay.
write her story. Her is uppercase. So
Right. Her
that's for
story.
tomorrow at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And
Okay.
that's a
Let
free
me.
webinar, but I think that if you can make it, you'll get information. It'll
Mhm.
start you off um,
Okay.
on going on a track of uncovering your money story. If I could leave your guests with one start, is that I would look at all of the areas of my life, that are
Mhm.
important. And for me, those areas are my spirituality, my relationships with myself and my family, my spiritual beliefs, and then my
Okay.
body. So those are my four quadrants of where I am. And I want to make sure that all the stories in those quadrants are
Mhm.
ones that they're the stories that I'm living, that I'm rewriting, that I'm living
Right.
life on my own terms, that I'm not allowing someone else's story to control the way that I live.
Okay.
My goal for women is that we learn to tell our own stories.
Our own stories.
And
Yes.
that comes from a very short African story, um, which is about a lion who was out, walking with his lion cub. And every time they ran across a lion in a hunter situation, they would hear the hunter say how he slayed the lion. And
Mm.
as years went on, the cub kept saying to his father, as years went on, the cub kept saying to his father, like, Dad, why is it that every time we go out and we hear about, the lion and the hunter, that the hunter always slays the lion? And his father said, the story will always end that way until the lion tells the story.
Wow.
So I'm asking women, we need to learn how to tell our own stories. We need to learn to shift the narratives about who we are as women.
Yeah. Awesome. I like that story. That's awesome. And believe it. Believe it. And I just when you said that you would want to talk about, we talked about a few things that you could have talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said, I want to talk about rewriting stories, I said, this is perfect because I want people to get in touch with themselves through the written word.
Yes.
It's so important to me. And I'll be promoting another session or modules for for journaling in particular. But one of these days, Sandra, we're going to get together and work together on a retreat because I think that if you can see Saundra in action in her productions that she has actually written and produced herself on stage,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing.
I
Um,
produce plays based on
yes,
stories.
stories on
Mhm.
stories. So, yeah, we would have a great retreat together and
It's
get
funny
that
you mentioned
working
that.
there.
It's funny you
Mhm.
mentioned that, Kathy, because I was just writing my vision board, and I wanted to do a 3-day retreat, um, immersion. So
Okay.
funny you said that
Okay.
now. So we're gonna make it happen.
We gonna make it happen.
We
Yes,
gotta make
indeed.
it
I'm
happen.
all about making things happen. I've had to pivot. I've had to get comfortable with a change of the way things um, were going for well site retreats. But I think it's meant to be.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I'll be doing something different, and this is definitely something I'd like to consider. So I want to say thank you. If you hold on for
Well,
a minute, thank you so much, Sandra, for joining me on one of my second live. I thank you, Sassy Diva JJ and Fran Lee, for joining us live and commenting. I appreciate you so much. And we'll be back with more of Wellside Retreats on YouTube channel. If you would like, subscribe. That's a thumbs up. Like and subscribe. I'd appreciate it. And you'll be notified when new videos are posted. So take care and be well.
thank you.